Man saves drowning bear. Hours later, a miracle happens. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. James had spent his life in the quiet embrace of nature. At 62, retired and widowed, he found solace in the wilderness, where towering pines whispered secrets and rivers carved paths through the heart of the mountains. His cabin, nestled near the river's edge, had become more than a retreat. It was his sanctuary. That morning, with a thermos of coffee and a fishing rod, he had set out along the riverbank, following a path he knew by heart. The water was restless, swollen from the spring thaw, rushing over jagged rocks in a symphony of power and danger. He loved the river's song, but he respected its force. Then the tranquility shattered, a desperate splashing. Erratic. Wild. James froze. His years in the wilderness had trained him to distinguish sounds. This was no ordinary disturbance. His heart quickened as he turned toward the river. There, struggling against the churning waters, was a bear cub. For a moment, James doubted his own eyes. The young bear, no older than a few months, was caught in the current, its small frame nearly swallowed by the rapids. It flailed, paws striking the air, mouth open in silent terror. Instinct warred with logic. James knew better than to interfere with a bear cub. Where there was a cub, a mother was near, and a mother bear, sensing a threat, would not hesitate to attack. But as he watched, the cub's head dipped beneath the surface, the river hungrily claiming its tiny body. James had seen enough death in his lifetime. His wife's slow battle with illness, his own father's final breath. He had learned that sometimes death came like a whisper, and sometimes it came roaring. But this was different. This was preventable. Before he could second-guess himself, James was moving. He tossed his fishing rod aside, stripped off his jacket, and plunged into the river. The cold stole his breath, wrapping around him like a vice, but he pushed forward. The current was brutal. It clawed at him, dragging him sideways, slamming him into unseen rocks beneath the surface. But his focus never wavered. He could still see the cub, weakly paddling, its small form moments from disappearing entirely. He reached out, fingers brushing wet fur. The cub thrashed, eyes wild with fear. But James didn't let go. He secured his grip beneath the animal's belly and turned toward shore. The return was worse. His legs burned, the river fought harder, and for one terrifying moment, he thought he might not make it. But then his boots found solid ground. With one final push, he stumbled onto the rocky shore, the cub limp in his arms. He collapsed, gasping. The bear cub shuddered in his grasp, coughing up water before releasing a weak, pitiful cry. And then another sound. A deep, guttural huff. James looked up. On the ridge above, partially hidden in the shadows of the trees, stood the mother bear. His stomach dropped. His entire body went rigid. She was massive. Her dark fur bristled, her breath visible in the cool air. Her eyes, intense, knowing, locked onto him and the cub in his arms. James had no weapon, no way to defend himself if she charged. He had only his wits, and right now they screamed at him to stay still. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Then, with slow, deliberate care, James lowered the cub onto the shore. It whimpered, trying to stand on shaky legs. The mother huffed again, a sound that sent shivers through him. Then she moved. She didn't charge. She didn't growl. She simply descended, her massive frame flowing over the rocky incline with the grace of something ancient and untamed. James remained frozen, barely breathing as the mother bear reached her cub. She sniffed it, nudging it with her nose. The cub responded with a weak cry, pressing itself against her. And then, something extraordinary happened. The mother bear lifted her head. Her gaze met James's once more, and in that moment, something passed between them. Not fear, not threat, but something older than language, understanding, gratitude. Then with one final look she turned, her cub limping alongside her as they disappeared into the trees. James sat there long after they were gone, the rush of the river, the only sound left in the world. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what had just happened. He had saved a life today. And somehow, impossibly, the wild had thanked him for it. Hours later, a miracle. That night, James sat on his porch, staring at the river. His body ached, his fingers still numb from the cold. But his mind was restless. He replayed the encounter over and over. Her eyes, that unspoken moment. Then, just as he was about to head inside, he heard it, a rustling in the trees. His heart pounded. He turned his head slowly, every sense on high alert. And there, standing just at the tree line, was the mother bear, alone. She didn't move closer. She didn't make a sound. She simply stood there watching him. James felt no fear. He knew somehow that she wasn't here to hurt him. For a long moment they simply regarded one another. Then, with that same deliberate grace, she turned and vanished into the night. James exhaled, realizing only then that he had been holding his breath. A miracle had happened that day. Not just the saving of a life, but the forming of a bond, however brief, between man and nature. Somewhere in those darkened woods, a mother bear remembered the human who had saved her child. And James, as he sat in the stillness of the night, knew that he would never be the same again. A life in his hands, James felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, but he refused to let go. The river roared in his ears, its icy grip dragging at his limbs, trying to pull him under. The bear cub in his arms thrashed wildly, its wet fur slick against his chest, tiny claws unintentionally digging into his skin. The current was relentless, threatening to rip them apart. Every muscle in James' body screamed in protest, but he gritted his teeth, holding the cub tight. His boots scraped against unseen rocks beneath the surface, seeking purchase as the river fought to reclaim them both. Not yet. With a final desperate heave, James lunged toward the bank. His fingers clawed at the muddy shoreline, grasping for anything solid. His free hand found a thick root jutting from the earth, and he used it as leverage, hauling himself up inch by inch. The cub whimpered, its struggles weakening. Almost there. Just a little more. Then, with one last push, James collapsed onto the riverbank, coughing up water, his chest heaving. The bear cub lay beside him, its small body trembling violently from cold and shock. James reached out with shaking hands, gently pressing his palm against its side. It was breathing. Relief crashed over him, but he knew they weren't safe yet. His own body was drenched, his limbs numb from the frigid water. He glanced around, taking in the darkening sky and the towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. He needed to get warm, fast, and more importantly, the cub needed help. That's when he heard it, a sound that sent ice through his veins, colder than the river itself, a low, guttural huff. James slowly turned his head. Standing just beyond the tree line, partially hidden in the dense underbrush, was the mother bear. She was massive, her thick coat bristling as she exhaled in deep, measured breaths. Her dark eyes locked onto him, her gaze flicking between James and her cub lying on the ground. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Every instinct screamed at him to back away, to retreat before she charged. But something held him still. The mother bear didn't move. She just watched. James didn't dare breathe. He knew he had only seconds to decide what to do next. If she saw him as a threat, she could cover the distance between them in a heartbeat. But if he ran, she might assume the worst and attack. Very slowly, James sat up, raising his hands in the universal gesture of surrender. The mother bear took a step forward. James tensed. His muscles coiled, preparing to throw himself out of the way if she lunged. But she didn't. Instead, she let out a deep, throaty exhale and took another step. Her gaze remained fixed on her cub, who was still curled in a shivering heap. James swallowed hard. His mind raced. Was she waiting for permission? Did she recognize that he had saved her baby? In a moment of pure instinct, James did something he never would have dared in any other circumstance. He reached out and, ever so gently, nudged the cub toward her. The tiny bear whimpered but managed to sit up, blinking drowsily. The mother bear let out a low moan, a sound so full of raw emotion that James felt it in his bones. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, she closed the distance between them. James held his breath as she approached. He could see the tension in her powerful frame, the way her nostrils flared as she inhaled his scent. Every fiber of his being told him he was too close, too vulnerable. But he didn't move. The mother bear bent her massive head and nudged her cub. The little one responded with a weak but eager cry, pressing itself against her. She licked its soaked fur, inspecting it for injuries, then turned her gaze back to James. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. It wasn't aggression he saw in her eyes, nor fear. It was something else entirely, recognition. Then, as if satisfied, she let out a final huff, and with surprising gentleness, scooped her cub up by the scruff of its neck. She didn't rush. She didn't flee. She simply turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the safety of the trees. James remained frozen long after she had gone, his body still thrumming with adrenaline. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at the empty space where she had stood. The wilderness had always been unpredictable, but this was something else. It had been an exchange, a silent agreement between man and beast, between two creatures who had nothing in common except the instinct to protect what was precious. James exhaled slowly, rubbing a shaking hand over his face. His body ached, his limbs were stiff with cold, but for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't expected. Connected. As the last light of day faded behind the mountains, he rose to his feet, casting one final look at the forest before making his way home. Somewhere out there, a mother bear carried her cub to safety, knowing, somehow, that a stranger had risked everything to save its life. And James, as he walked alone beneath the starlit sky, knew he would never forget the day he had looked into the eyes of a wild animal and understood something without words. A miracle had happened that day. Not just that he had saved a life, but that, in the vast untamed world, a bear had chosen to trust him. And that trust, fragile and fleeting as it was, had changed him forever. The bond that shouldn't have been. James sat beside the dying fire, watching the young bear as the first golden streaks of morning light filtered through the trees. The embers cast a dull glow against the damp earth, their warmth barely keeping the chill at bay. His body ached from exhaustion, every muscle stiff from the fight against the river. But he was alive, and so was the cub. The small bear lifted its head groggily, blinking against the sunlight. Its damp fur had dried overnight, fluffing slightly in the morning air. James wasn't sure what he had expected. To wake up and find the cub gone, perhaps, having regained enough strength to slip back into the wilderness. But it was still there, nestled in his flannel shirt, watching him with wary, intelligent eyes. It should have run by now. Any normal wild animal would. Instead, it just sat there, breathing steadily, staring at him, as though it was trying to make sense of the man who had pulled it from certain death. James let out a slow breath. His mind was still reeling from the events of the night before. He had spent years in the wilderness, hiking deep into forests where few dared to tread, always respecting the delicate balance of nature. But this was different. He had interfered. And now, he had no idea what to do next. The bear cub shifted slightly, sniffing the air. It was weak, but it was improving. Maybe in a few more hours it would wander off, return to wherever it had come from. Maybe its mother was still searching for it. That thought sent a shiver down James' spine. He had seen no sign of the mother bear last night, but that didn't mean she wasn't out there. Watching, waiting. The thought made him uneasy. James slowly stood, stretching his sore limbs, keeping his movements slow so as not to startle the cub. He needed to pack up and get moving. It was too risky to linger any longer, but as he stepped away from the fire, a deep, low sound rumbled through the trees. James froze. A growl. Not an aggressive one, but a warning. His breath hitched as he turned his head toward the tree line. There, standing between the towering pines, half hidden in the morning mist, was her. The mother bear. She was massive. Easily 3 times his size, her thick fur rippling as she exhaled, her dark eyes locked onto him. He felt the weight of her gaze, primal and unreadable. His heart pounded in his chest, every instinct screaming at him to retreat. The cub made a small noise, a whimpering, needy sound. The mother bear took a step forward. James didn't move. He knew running would be the worst mistake he could make. If she saw him as a threat, there was nothing he could do. He had no weapon, no plan, just his heartbeat hammering in his ears, and the knowledge that he was far too close to something that could kill him in an instant. The mother bear took another step. Then another. She was close now, close enough that he could see the deep brown of her eyes, the way her nostrils flared as she scented the air. The cub remained still, watching her, watching her. James swallowed. This was it, the moment of truth. Very slowly, keeping his movements deliberate, he took a step back, his hands raised slightly in a show of surrender. The mother bear didn't react. Instead, she let out a deep, rumbling huff and walked past him. James' breath hitched. She ignored him completely, moving straight to the cub. The little one let out a small cry, crawling toward her as she sniffed it, checking for injuries. James held his breath, expecting her to turn on him at any second. But she didn't. She only inspected the cub, nudging it with her massive head, licking the damp fur as if to reassure herself that it was real. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she lifted her head and looked at him. James had never seen anything like it. This wasn't a look of anger or suspicion. It wasn't a challenge or a threat. It was something else entirely. Recognition. She knew. She knew he had saved her cub. The realization sent a strange, numbing sensation through his body. The bear let out a final huff, then nudged the cub again. It tried to stand but stumbled, its legs still weak. The mother bent down, and with the gentlest of movements, picked it up by the scruff of its neck. James stayed rooted in place as she turned, the cub hanging limply from her jaws. She began to walk away, back into the depths of the forest, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. She didn't run, she didn't rush. She simply left, taking her child home. James exhaled, his legs suddenly weak. He dropped to a crouch, pressing his hands against the damp earth, his pulse still racing. It was over. And yet, something had changed. James had spent his life respecting the wild, observing it from a distance, never interfering. But last night, he had stepped beyond that unspoken boundary, and instead of punishment, he had been given trust. He let out a shaky laugh, running a hand through his damp hair. What were the odds? What were the chances that he, of all people, would stumble upon that exact stretch of river at the exact moment the cub had needed him? That the mother bear wouldn't see him as an enemy, but as something else, something safe. James didn't have an answer, but as he packed up his gear and started his hike back, he felt different. Lighter. As though something deep inside him had shifted, something he didn't fully understand yet. He cast one last look at the forest behind him, at the place where the mother bear and her cub had vanished. Somewhere out there she was carrying her baby home. And James, somehow, felt less alone than he had in years. A shadow that wouldn't leave James trudged through the dense forest, his boots pressing into the damp earth, every step slow and deliberate. His body ached from the frigid river, muscles stiff and sore, but he pushed forward, determined to leave the past few hours behind him. He had done his part. The cub was alive, breathing, free to return to its world. And yeah, the soft padding of paws behind him sent a chill up his spine. James stopped. The sound stopped. His breath came out in a slow exhale as he turned. The bear cub stood a few feet back, small but persistent, its dark eyes locked onto him, with a look he couldn't quite decipher. Its fur, now mostly dry, fluffed slightly in the morning breeze. It should have been running deep into the wilderness by now, but it wasn't. James ran a hand over his damp face, frustration settling into his chest. "You don't belong with me," he muttered, glancing at the trees, hoping the cub would understand that it was supposed to be there, not following him. The cub didn't move. James sighed, shifting his backpack higher on his shoulders. He turned and started walking again, ignoring the uneasy feeling creeping up his spine. But the sound came again. Soft paws against the earth, always a few steps behind. James stopped. So did the cub. He spun on his heel. "No," he said firmly, stomping his foot lightly on the ground. "Go. Get out of here." The cub flinched but didn't retreat. It just stood there, its small body tense, waiting. James narrowed his eyes. This wasn't normal. Wild animals, especially young ones, relied on instinct to survive. The moment they sensed danger, they fled. But this cub, it was clinging to him like he was the only safe thing in its world. And that realization made something twist in his chest. "Fine," he muttered, shaking his head. "Stay there, but don't get any ideas." James turned and picked up his pace, forcing himself to ignore the soft padding behind him. He was heading toward his cabin, a good few hours' hike away. Eventually the cub would give up, get bored, or better yet, find its mother. But it didn't. Mile after mile, the cub followed. Always close. Always watching. James tried everything. He walked faster, hoping to lose it in the underbrush. He stopped abruptly, hoping it would grow impatient and leave. He even tried ignoring it entirely. Nothing worked. Every time he looked over his shoulder, those dark, round eyes stared back at him, a quiet shadow that refused to disappear. Frustration turned into something else, something heavier. What if the cub had no mother to return to? The thought gnawed at him. He had no way of knowing if the cub had been lost before the river took it, or if its mother had been somewhere in those rushing waters, fighting against the current, trying to save her baby and failing. James clenched his jaw. No, he couldn't think about that. That wasn't his problem. But as the hours stretched on, exhaustion seeping into his bones, that small shape behind him didn't waver. And for the first time, James wondered if he could really walk away. By the time he reached his cabin, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the clearing. The cub hesitated at the tree line, sniffing the air cautiously. James turned, setting his pack down with a heavy sigh. "All right, kid," he muttered. "Last chance. Go find your home." The cub didn't move. Instead, it sat down, curling its small paws beneath its body, its eyes locked onto James like it had made up its mind. James scrubbed a hand down his face, exhaustion warring with frustration. "You're not a dog," he reminded the cub, pointing toward the trees. "I'm not your pack. You can't just—" A rustling sound cut him off. James stiffened. The cub did too, ears perking. The sound came again. Branches shifting, underbrush moving. A presence. Something was watching them. James moved instinctively, stepping between the cub and the tree. His heart pounded as he scanned the shadows, breath tight in his chest. Then the deep, unmistakable sound of a low growl rumbled through the air. James' pulse spiked. A figure emerged from the tree line, massive and dark against the fading light. The mother. James barely breathed. She was huge, easily over 300 pounds, her thick fur rippling as she moved forward, her powerful shoulders shifting with every step. The cub let out a soft, high-pitched whimper. The mother bear stopped. James held his ground, his entire body rigid. He knew better than to run. Running meant prey. Running meant death. But she wasn't charging. She was waiting. Her dark eyes flicked from James to the cub, then back again. There was no blind aggression in her posture, no immediate rage, just something measured. James didn't move. The cub took a hesitant step forward, then another. The mother huffed, lowering her massive head, nostrils flaring as she took in her baby's scent. The cub whimpered again and rushed toward her, pressing its small body into her thick fur. A sound rumbled from deep within the mother's chest. Not a growl, but something else. Something softer. Relief. James exhaled shakily, his hands still clenched at his sides. The mother bear nudged the cub, inspecting it, licking the damp fur as if reassuring herself that it was real. Then, slowly, she looked back at James and held his gaze. James couldn't explain it. He had never believed in those ridiculous stories about animals showing gratitude, but there was something in her expression that felt different. Not trust, not quite, but something close. She let out one last huff, then turned, nudging the cub toward the forest. James stood rooted in place as they disappeared into the shadows, the cub glancing back one last time before following its mother into the wild where it belonged. The clearing was silent again. James let out a slow breath, tension bleeding from his shoulders. He should have felt relief. He should have been grateful that it hadn't ended in disaster. Instead, as he stared at the empty space where the cub had been, a strange hollowness settled in his chest. He had saved a life today, but somehow, inexplicably, it felt like something had changed in him too. And as he turned toward his cabin, James knew one thing for certain. He would never forget the way that Bear had looked at him, or how, for the briefest moment, he had understood. A debt repaid, James stood frozen, his breath shallow, as the mother bear fixed her gaze on him. The weight of her presence was suffocating, primal, and incomprehensible. He had faced bears before, seen them at a distance, heard stories of their unpredictable nature. But never like this. Never like this. The cub let out a soft whimper, still weak from its ordeal, and took slow, wobbling steps toward its mother. She sniffed it over, nudging it with a massive paw, checking for injuries. James knew he should feel relief. This is where the story ends. This is where they leave. But she didn't leave. Instead, she looked at him again. A deep, guttural sound rumbled from her throat. Not a growl, not a threat, but something else entirely. And then, she stepped back. James flinched as the shadows shifted behind her. Movement. Something he hadn't noticed before. His breath caught as his eyes adjusted to the dim firelight, and then he saw it. A deer, lying motionless in the grass just beyond the clearing. James' mind stuttered, his thoughts tangling in confusion. Had she just... His instinct screamed at him that this was impossible. Bears were hunters, scavengers, survivalists. They didn't share. They didn't make offerings. And yet, the mother bear lowered her head slightly, never breaking eye contact. James felt a chill crawl down his spine. Not fear. Something deeper. Something ancient, primal, a recognition of something beyond logic. This was a gift, an exchange, a debt repaid. James swallowed, his throat dry. He had saved her cub, pulled it from the merciless grasp of the river when nature had already decided its fate. And now, The mother bear had chosen to acknowledge that act in the only way she knew how. The realization sent a shockwave through him. What was he supposed to do? He wanted to step back, to show deference, to let the moment pass. But something inside him, something instinctive, told him that would be a mistake. This wasn't a moment to refuse. This was a moment to understand. Slowly, carefully, James lowered his hands to his sides, signaling that he wasn't a threat. The mother bear didn't move, only watching as he took one tentative step toward the offering. His heart pounded against his ribs. Every fiber of his being screamed at him that this was unnatural. But wasn't his survival in the wild always dictated by instinct, by respect? And hadn't she just shown him the same? He knelt beside the deer, fingers brushing over its still warm fur. He wasn't sure what compelled him to do it, but he inclined his head slightly toward the bear, not a bow, not submission, but an unspoken acknowledgement. The mother bear huffed softly, an almost inaudible breath against the cold night air. Then, as if her purpose had been fulfilled, she turned. The cub hesitated, looking between James and its mother, then let out a soft huff and scurried after her. James stayed kneeling, watching as they melted back into the forest, their massive forms swallowed by the night. And then they were gone. The fire crackled beside him, its warmth suddenly feeling insignificant compared to what had just happened. James sat back on his heels, his mind racing. He had heard stories before, old myths, whispers passed down through generations, of bears forming bonds with humans, tales of hunters who had spared a cub only to find their own life spared years later in the wild. But he had never believed them, until now, because what had just happened was real. A bear had given him a gift, not out of necessity, not out of instinct, but out of something else entirely. Gratitude? Respect? James didn't know. And maybe he never would. But as he sat there, staring at the spot where the bears had vanished, he felt something shift inside him. Something that told him he had just been part of a story that would stay with him forever. And maybe, just maybe, one that had begun long before this night. The following morning, James woke with the first light, the scent of pine and damp earth filling his lungs. He sat up slowly, the ache in his muscles reminding him that last night hadn't been a dream. The deer carcass was still there. James ran a hand over his face, staring at it, trying to decide what to do. He wouldn't take more than he needed. That was the unspoken rule of the wild. He could use the meat, but it had to be done with respect. It had been given with respect. James spent the morning carefully preparing what he could, leaving the rest for the scavengers. The balance of nature would handle the rest. By the time the sun had fully risen, the clearing felt different, lighter. Like something unseen had settled. James shouldered his pack and turned toward the forest. He would be heading back toward town soon, but he knew, without a doubt, that he would return. Because something had changed here. Something that felt like a promise. And as James stepped onto the trail, disappearing into the trees, he knew deep down, this wouldn't be the last time their paths would cross. A bond beyond nature. James stood at the edge of his cabin's clearing, staring into the dense forest where the bears had disappeared. The night had swallowed them whole, leaving behind only the rustling of leaves and the dying crackle of his fire. But even as silence reclaimed the wilderness, James knew nothing would ever be the same. His breath came slow, controlled, yet his pulse still pounded in his ears. The weight of what had happened pressed against his chest. A mother bear had offered him a gift. A wild creature had acknowledged him. James shivered, though not from the cold. He had spent years in these mountains, carving out a life between the trees, learning to respect the rules of the untamed world. But tonight, those rules had shifted, just enough for something miraculous to slip through. He turned, his gaze falling upon the untouched deer carcass at the tree line. It lay exactly where the mother bear had left it, its presence an unspoken question. James took a slow step toward it, then stopped. It wasn't his to take. He didn't need the meat. The gesture meant more than the offering itself. Taking it would feel wrong, so he left it there. The next morning, it was gone. Whether the mother bear had returned for it or whether other creatures had taken their share, James never knew. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the act itself. Shadows in the forest days passed. The river's roar remained steady. The wind whispered through the trees, and life continued as it always had. Yet, James felt something different lingering in the air. A presence, a knowing. He wasn't alone. He caught glimpses of it in the periphery of his vision. A flicker of movement between the trees. A shifting shadow in the distance. A rustle of branches where there was no wind. He wasn't afraid. It wasn't that kind of watching. The feeling was familiar now. A silent check-in, a quiet acknowledgement. The mother bear. Sometimes when he was out collecting firewood or hiking the ridgeline, he would catch sight of her. Just for a moment. She never approached. Never threatened. She was simply there. And then, one evening, she returned. James had been sitting on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, when he felt it. The unmistakable weight of eyes on him. Slowly, he turned. At the edge of the clearing, half hidden in the golden light of dusk, she stood. The mother bear. Beside her, the cub. James felt his breath hitch. The cub had grown in just a short time. Its fur fuller, its stance stronger. No longer the fragile, shivering creature he had pulled from the river. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then, as if to acknowledge their strange connection one final time, the mother bear did something unexpected. She lowered her head. It wasn't submission. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. James didn't move, didn't even blink, afraid that if he did, the spell would break. The cub looked up at him, its dark eyes locked onto his, filled with something James could only describe as memory. Then just like that, the moment was over. The mother bear turned, slipping back into the trees. The cub hesitated, just for a heartbeat, before following her into the fading light. And then, they were gone. A story left untold. James never saw them again. He never spoke about what had happened that night. To most, it would have sounded like nothing more than a wild tale. An exaggeration spun from solitude and moonlight. But James knew the truth. He had witnessed something rare, something few ever would. A moment that defied logic, that blurred the line between instinct and understanding. A moment where the wild had spoken back. And he had listened. From that day forward, James saw the wilderness differently. Not just as a place to survive, but as something alive. Something that watched. That remembered. Something that sometimes, just sometimes, offered a hand back when you least expected it. The legacy of a silent connection. Years passed. Seasons came and went, and James remained in his small cabin by the river, living by the quiet rules of the land. But every so often on cold winter nights, when the wind howled through the trees, he would think about them. The mother bear, the cub, and the night the wild had repaid a debt. He never doubted that somewhere deep in the forest, they still remembered him. And though they never returned, he never felt alone, because some connections once formed never truly fade. They live on in the hush of the trees, in the whisper of the wind, in the quiet understanding between man and beast, where words have no place, only trust. And that was the real miracle. The lesson of the wild, trust, kindness, and unexpected bonds. James' story is more than just a tale of survival and a miraculous encounter with the wild. It's a profound lesson about trust, kindness, and the unexpected ways in which life repays the good we put into the world. In today's fast-paced, often disconnected world, we rarely pause to recognize the unseen forces that shape our experiences. Yet, Just like James' encounter with the mother bear, life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it, teaching us that compassion and courage never go unnoticed. We live in a time where acts of kindness sometimes feel undervalued, where skepticism and self-interest often take precedence. Society encourages us to move fast, to protect ourselves first, and to be wary of strangers. But James' story reminds us that true strength lies in choosing to help, even when it comes at great risk, not for recognition, not for reward, but simply because it is the right thing to do. In that moment by the river, James had a choice: walk away and let nature take its course, or risk his own safety to save a life. He chose the latter, not knowing that this single act of selflessness would be repaid in a way he never could have imagined. This mirrors life in many ways. How often do we find ourselves in situations where we have the chance to extend a hand to someone struggling? Maybe it's a colleague who needs support but is too afraid to ask, a stranger who looks lost, or even a friend who seems fine on the surface but is drowning in their own battles beneath it. Do we turn away, assuming it's not our problem? Or do we take the risk, step forward, and offer help, even if we don't know what will come of it? James' story also highlights the power of trust and non-verbal communication. The mother bear didn't have words to thank him. She didn't leave a note, didn't shake his hand. She simply acknowledged him in the way her world allowed. And isn't that how life often works? The appreciation for kindness doesn't always come in direct forms. Sometimes it's in a quiet nod, a returned favor when you least expect it, or the simple knowledge that you made someone's burden lighter. But perhaps the most beautiful lesson in James' experience is that some connections, even the most unlikely ones, leave lasting imprints. In a world that constantly tells us we are separate, that we are different, that survival is an individual battle, this story reminds us that everything is connected. Our actions ripple outward in ways we can't always see. The next time you hesitate to help someone, thinking it won't matter, remember James and the mother bear. The wild has its own way of repaying kindness. And so does life. Sometimes the reward isn't immediate, isn't grand, isn't even visible. But trust that it's there, woven into the fabric of the universe, waiting for the right moment to remind you that no good deed is ever truly forgotten. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.